Egypt and Jordan say phase 2 of US President Donald Trump's Gaza plan must be fully implemented. Netanyahu formally joins President Trump's Board of Peace. And Iran's Defense Council declares the country's missile systems a red line. Egypt and Jordan say phase 2 of US President Donald Trump's Gaza plan must be implemented fully with uninterrupted aid and steps towards early recovery. Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati spoke by phone with Jordan's Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi discussing Gaza and wider regional developments. The two ministers stressed the need for humanitarian aid to flow without obstacles and for early recovery to begin with preparations for reconstruction. They also backed the work of the National Committee for Gaza Administration and efforts to deploy an international stabilization force to monitor the ceasefire, paving the way for Palestinian Authority to resume full responsibilities in Gaza. The call also covered coordination ahead of a planned Peace Council meeting in Washington, support for Trump's stated opposition to annexing the West Bank, and renewed calls for a two-state solution with a sovereign Palestinian state on the June 24th, 1967 lines, with East Jerusalem as its capital. In Gaza City, the sounds of shelling have largely faded, but the silence is being filled by the quiet dispersion of hunger. And even with a ceasefire in place for 4 months now, thousands are still lining up at charity kitchens for what might be their only meal of the day. Despite the October 10th ceasefire agreement, humanitarian conditions across the Gaza Strip remain critical. UN agencies report that while some aid is trickling in through the Karm Shalom and Rafah crossings, the volume is far below what is needed for the 2 million people now almost entirely dependent on external support. In Gaza City, again, the World Food Programme and partners like World Central Kitchen have scaled up operations, but they face a constant uphill battle. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has formally joined President Trump's Board of Peace, a controversial new body tasked with managing Gaza's future. Behind the scenes in Washington, the Prime Minister's real mission is clear: hardening the U.S. stance against Iran's nuclear program. The signing ceremony took place at Blair House on Wednesday, where Netanyahu met with Secretary of State Marco Rubio ahead of a 3-hour closed-door session with President Donald Trump. By joining the board, Israel aligns itself with a U.S.-led initiative that bypasses traditional UN frameworks to oversee Gaza's reconstruction and security. However, sources say Netanyahu's primary focus in Washington is the Iran threat as the Trump administration enters a second month of renewed nuclear diplomacy with Tehran. The Israeli premier is reportedly pushing for a maximum pressure approach. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. Guterres added that the situation in Gaza and the West Bank is unbearable, stressing the evacuations and settler violence are making life more difficult for Palestinians. On another front, Guterres said that the humanitarian situation in Sudan has reached an intolerable level, calling for an end to conflict and for efforts to ease the suffering. And for more analysis, we now move on to my dear colleague Mark Summers. Mark?
Thank you very much, Rani. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. We're now joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, who's an international relations specialist. Thank you very much for being here with us on Q News. So Trump's Board of Peace, which operates outside the UN, is being put together. Do you think it might change the traditional role of international law when it comes to solving the Gaza crisis?
Thank you for having me, Mark. Always a pleasure to be with you. First of all, we should not really consider at this point the Board of Peace as something that is acting beyond the realm or the premise of international law, because so far this is not the case. There is no ample evidence that has been presented or that has been detected or documented through how this nascent institution functions that might indicate that it is that it constitutes any violation or breach of international law. If anything, it's just another international organization that will serve to at least officially and theoretically to uphold world peace and to engage in peace building and conflict resolution. And so far, President Trump has been eager, even though he bashes the UN every now and then and does accuse it of being inept and ineffective, yet he never insinuated clearly and openly that this organization would supplant the United Nations. At best, it could be a parallel institution that will compete with the United Nations in its peace-building efforts and in its conflict resolution efforts. And there is no reason, really, to think that both institutions have to be mutually exclusive. If anything, they might complement one another if the United States is eager to maintain the United Nations as the primary global institution which represents the international order, basically. However, does this mean that this move might eventually serve to undermine the United Nations' role and effectiveness over time? Yes, this could be the case. However, the effectiveness of the United Nations has been undermined long ago. However, also at the same time, we cannot really assess the viability and the effectiveness of the Board of Peace because it has not been tested yet. And I think that we will have a testing ground that will show how effective it is, and that is the Gaza crisis. Let's never forget, Mark, that the Board of Peace or the Peace Council was created specifically at first to be the governing body that will lead the post-war situation in Gaza in terms of reconstruction, replacing the current structures of government and imposing peace one way or enforcing peace one way or the other. So if the Board of Peace fails in its primary focus point, which is Gaza, I think that it ends before it even starts.
I know you haven't got a lot of time. I just wanted to get this question in because Netanyahu has now formally become a member of the Board of Peace. What does this mean for Gaza's sovereignty? As you say, it's meant to deal with Gaza in the first instance. Does this give Israel some kind of permanent veto over how Gaza is reconstructed?
Well, of course, Israel already has this veto, unfortunately, with or without the membership of the Board of peace, because Israel really it subscribes to the logic of enforcing certain realities by force of arms on the ground, and not necessarily through any institutional frameworks. So whether they are members of the Board of Peace is irrelevant. If anything, them becoming members of the Board of Peace could be a positive indicator in some sense, because basically it means that the United States is pushing them to to adhere more to the settlement framework for Gaza that is dictated by the Trump plan, which Israel signed off on. So basically, probably, or hopefully at least, this will place more obligations on the Israeli side. However, these obligations will never really be attached to Israel without any pressure from the United States. The United States has to transfer its mode of work or its mode of action from its wishes, its wishful thinking, its wishes that the peace plan be enforced, to actual concrete action on the ground that can be read as a genuine will that is translated into measures on the ground. And measures necessitate that the United States place a significant amount of pressure on the Israelis so that they would conform to their obligations, comply with their obligations under the peace plan. So far, we have not seen any serious indications of that, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Osman. Always a pleasure to have you here on Q News with us and get your insights into these times. We shall continue to watch how the Board of Peace develops. Thank you very much for joining us. And it's back to you, Rana, in the studio.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your in-depth analysis. And now for the latest developments on the US-Iran talks. From Tehran today, as the head of Iran's Defense Council, Ali Shamkhani, declares the country's missile systems a red line, while signaling a potential opening for talks with Washington. Shamkhani warned that any military adventure against Iran would trigger a massive response. Speaking today, Friday, February the 13th, Ali Shamkhani reaffirmed that Iran's ballistic missile capabilities are strictly for defense and will never be placed on the negotiating table. These remarks follow a week of intense diplomatic maneuvering, including a high-stakes meeting between President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington. Shamkhani noted that while indirect talks in Oman have shown positive signs, success depends on the U.S. adopting a realistic approach without what he called excessive demands. President Donald Trump has issued his most severe warning yet to Iranian leadership. In a high-stakes ultimatum delivered from the White House, the president is demanding a nuclear deal within 30 days, or Tehran will face what he calls very traumatic consequences. Speaking to reporters on Thursday, February the 12th, President Donald Trump repeatedly used the word traumatic to describe the potential future for Iran if diplomacy falls, or rather fails. The warning follows a 3-hour meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who traveled to Washington to push for a harder line against Tehran's ballistic missile and nuclear activities. Trump recalled the Midnight Hammer strikes of June 2025, which targeted Iranian nuclear sites, as a reminder of U.S. military resolve. While the president stated that a diplomatic Phase 1 deal is his preference, he warned that Phase 2 would be very tough for the Islamic Republic. Following a high-stakes diplomatic tour of Oman and Qatar, Iran's top security official is setting the record straight. Ali Larijani says that while messages were exchanged via intermediaries, Tehran has not sent any formal letters to Washington, and the wall of distrust remains as high as ever. Larijani, Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, concluded his two-day Gulf tour late on Wednesday with a firm message to both domestic and international audiences. Speaking to state-run IRIB-TV, Larijani clarified that while many mediators provided written points from the United States side for review in Tehran, Iran did not reciprocate with a letter of its own. This diplomatic push comes as President Trump ramps up the pressure, setting a one-month deadline for a deal and warning of traumatic consequences if negotiations fail. The African Union Peace and Security Council has issued two statements in Somalia and Sudan, adopted under Egypt's chairmanship, stressing sovereignty and support for stability. The Council statements followed two ministerial sessions held on February the 12th, reviewing political and security developments in Somalia and Sudan and ways to back national efforts to restore stability, strengthen state institutions, and safeguard unity and territorial integrity. The PSC also underlined respect for sovereignty and non-interference, and also called for stronger regional and international support to address root causes and advance sustainable security. Egypt's presidency of the Council was cited in reflecting Cairo's active role in supporting the AU peace and security architecture and coordination on crises across the continent.
I'm trying not to.
The United Nations has released this chilling report on the fall of al-Fashir, detailing a preventable human rights catastrophe. New data reveals that nearly 6,000 people were slaughtered in just the first 3 days of the Rapid Support Forces offensive last October. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk presented the findings in Geneva today, following a personal visit to survivors. The report describes the capture of North Darfur's wave of intense violence that included mass evacuations at El Fasher University and systematic ethnic cleansing targeting the Zagahawa community. Witnesses who escaped to eastern Chad described scenes of horror with piles of bodies lining the roads in what one survivor called a day of judgment. Beyond the killings, the UN documented widespread gang rape, abductions for ransom, and the forced recruitment of children. The road to peace in Ukraine may soon run through Florida. The criminal has confirmed that the third round of trilateral talks is set for next week, just as U.S. officials propose moving the high-stakes negotiations from the Middle East to Miami. Criminal spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters today that there is now a clear understanding regarding the timing of the next meeting, though Moscow has yet to formally sign off on the American venue. This follows two previous rounds held in Abu Dhabi, which established a fragile energy truce and led to a major prisoner swap earlier this month. A senior Ukrainian army doctor has delivered a chilling wake-up call to European leaders at the Munich Security Conference. Speaking from the now newly opened Ukraine House, he warned that Europe must learn from Ukraine's trauma before the conflict crosses their own borders. Head of the medical department for Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps, it didn't mince words today on the sidelines of the summit. Standing in the Ukraine House, a new dedicated venue for the 2026 conference, he told reporters delegates that his country is now Europe's best partner because they are already living in the future of war. The veteran doctor's warning came just hours after the facility was officially inaugurated by Ukrainian Foreign Minister and his German counterpart.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
If you look at that,
Or we're out.
French police have detained 9 people in a probe into suspected ticket fraud at the Louvre, with prosecutors saying the scheme may have cost the museum around 10 million euros. The Paris prosecutor's office says that those held include 2 Louvre officials, several tour guides, and a suspected organizer. Authorities say the suspected network repeatedly reused single-entry tickets to bring in tourist groups while bribing staff to ignore the practice. Police seized close to 1 million euros in cash and nearly 500,000 euros in bank accounts, and prosecutors say similar fraud may have targeted the Palace of the Versailles. Top Western leaders have converged on Germany today for the 62nd Munich Security Conference, facing a global order described as under destruction. Officials from the EU and NATO are demanding a massive, permanent increase in European military spending to safeguard the transatlantic alliance. In a rare joint press conference this Friday morning, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte set a firm tone for the 3-day summit. Von der Leyen highlighted that 2025 marked the largest surge in European defense investment in over a decade, driven by the new Readiness Roadmap 2030. NATO Chief Mark Rutte acknowledged the long-standing US complaints regarding European spending, stating that the era of complaints is over as Europe steps up its responsibility. Tokyo and Washington have agreed to quicken the pace of a massive $550 billion investment deal, with Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi set to visit the White House next month. Japanese officials are racing to settle technical disputes over interest rates and high-risk projects. Japanese Trade Minister met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington yesterday for 85 minutes of what he described as very tough negotiations. The two sides are struggling to finalize the first batch of projects under the historic trade agreement struck last summer. Akazawa admitted that a significant gap remains regarding business risk assessments and projected interest rates. Japan is reportedly hesitant to use taxpayer money on high-risk, high-return ventures, favoring stable infrastructure instead.
米国と
The Trump administration has launched what it calls the single largest deregulatory action in U.S. history by revoking the landmark 2009 endangerment finding. The government is effectively dismantling the legal foundation for nearly all federal climate regulations. President Trump and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin finalized the rule, officially declaring the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane no longer constitute a legally recognized threat to public health. This move erases the scientific leaning that has allowed the EPA to regulate emissions and power plant pollution for 16 years. The White House claims the repeal will save American families over $1.3 trillion by lowering car prices by an average of $2,400 per vehicle. Devastating floods have hit central Portugal after the Mondego River breached its banks, triggering a major dike collapse. Thousands have been forced to evacuate as torrential rain continues to batter the region. The collapse near Coimbra has submerged entire fields and residential areas, compounding a weeks-long crisis. On the A1 motorway, Portugal's main transport artery, a section of the road gave way after relief failed underneath. Infrastructure Minister warns that repairs will take weeks and cannot begin until what levels recede. Emergency crews are currently conducting door-to-door checks to assist the 3,000 residents ordered to flee their homes. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin, but before we wrap up, here's a recap of the top stories making headlines this hour. Egypt and Jordan say Phase 2 of U.S. President Donald Trump's Gaza plan must be fully implemented. Netanyahu formally joins President Trump's Board of Peace. And Iran's Defense Council declares the country's missile systems a red line. For more stories and live updates, follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at QNewsEG. From all of us here, thank you very much for watching and stay tuned for more news and analysis on Qnews.